The first time Rowan Mercer carried groceries onto Mrs. Beatrice Holloway's porch, he thought he was just helping an old woman with sore knees. 6 months later, he stood on that same porch holding a bag filled with milk, fresh bread, and her favorite strawberry jam. The front door opened like always, but instead of Mrs. Holloway, the woman standing there was the same CEO who had ended his career with a single meeting 8 months earlier. If you believe in kindness and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner 2.0. Every weekday, Rowan followed almost the same routine. He woke before sunrise in his small rented duplex outside Cedar Ridge, Oregon. His 9-year-old son, Owen, usually slept with one arm wrapped around an old stuffed bear that had lost one button years ago. Rowan would quietly make oatmeal, pack Owen's lunch, and leave a note beside the cereal bowl if he had an early shift. Life had become carefully measured. Every gallon of gas mattered. Every grocery receipt stayed folded in his wallet. Every unexpected expense meant moving money from somewhere else. Just 8 months earlier, none of that had seemed necessary. Rowan had spent nearly 12 years working as an operations manager for Halcyon Logistics, one of the region's fastest-growing shipping companies. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't the loudest person in meetings. But he solved problems before they became disasters, remembered employees' birthdays, and stayed late whenever a warehouse team needed help. Then the company hired a new CEO. Her name was Vanessa Ashcroft. She arrived with expensive consultants, polished presentations, and a promise to modernize everything. Within weeks, departments were reorganized, long-time managers were replaced, and every decision was measured by quarterly numbers. Rowan had tried to adapt. But one afternoon he quietly disagreed during a meeting. Cutting experienced warehouse staff before the holiday season, he argued, would slow deliveries instead of saving money. Vanessa had listened without interrupting. 2 days later, Human Resources asked him into a conference room. His position had been eliminated. Officially, it was restructuring. Unofficially, everyone knew exactly why. Finding another management job wasn't easy. Companies wanted younger candidates or people willing to relocate hundreds of miles away. Rowan couldn't. Owen had already lost enough after his mother left 3 years earlier to start a new life across the country. Rowan refused to uproot him again. Eventually he accepted work delivering groceries for a neighborhood delivery service. The pay wasn't close to what he'd earned before, but it kept food on their own table. One rainy Thursday afternoon his delivery route took him to a small white house covered with climbing roses. Mrs. Beatrice Holloway answered after nearly 2 minutes. "I'm sorry," she laughed softly. "These knees negotiate every staircase." She insisted on carrying one bag herself. Halfway across the porch she nearly dropped it. Rowan gently took it back. "I've got it." She smiled. "You remind me of my husband." From then on, he saw her every Tuesday and Friday. Sometimes she asked him to place groceries on the kitchen counter. Sometimes she'd forgotten to order batteries or tea. Sometimes she'd simply ask how Owen was doing. Little by little, those deliveries stopped feeling like work. Mrs. Holloway lived alone after losing her husband nearly 15 years earlier. Her only daughter traveled constantly for business. She never complained. Instead she filled awkward silences by telling stories about raising tomatoes that never seemed to survive Oregon rain or about the old golden retriever she'd loved decades earlier. Rowan usually stayed only 5 minutes. Never longer. He didn't want kindness to become an obligation. Winter arrived early that year. One icy morning he noticed newspapers piling beside her front steps. He knocked. No answer. He called through the door. Nothing. His stomach tightened. Just as he considered calling emergency services, the lock clicked. Mrs. Holloway stood there wrapped in a blanket. "I've had the flu," she admitted. "You should have called someone." "I didn't want to bother anyone." "You wouldn't." That afternoon, after finishing every delivery, Rowan returned with soup from a diner near his apartment. He left it beside the door with a handwritten note. No signature. She knew who it was. After that, helping became routine. He replaced a flickering porch bulb. He raked leaves before winter storms. He carried heavy bags inside without being asked. Sometimes Owen came along on Saturdays. The boy fixed loose bird feeders while Mrs. Holloway baked cinnamon muffins that somehow always tasted warmer than they should. Watching them together made Rowan realize Owen smiled more there than he had in months. One afternoon Mrs. Holloway looked toward the backyard. "You know," she said quietly, "people think loneliness feels loud." She paused. "It doesn't. It usually sounds like an empty kitchen." Rowan never forgot that sentence. Around Christmas, money became painfully tight. Owen needed new winter boots. The car required unexpected brake repairs. The landlord announced a rent increase beginning in February. One evening Rowan sat at the kitchen table staring at bills after Owen had gone to bed. For the first time since losing his job, he wondered whether he'd failed. Not because he wasn't working. Because he couldn't seem to get ahead no matter how hard he tried. The next morning Owen noticed him rubbing his forehead. "We're okay, Dad." Rowan smiled. "We're okay." He wasn't completely sure. January brought freezing rain. Mrs. Holloway's daughter called Rowan one afternoon. She had found his number through delivery records. "I'm embarrassed asking this," she admitted, "but Mom won't tell me when she needs help. Would you mind checking on her this week? I'm stuck in Boston." Of course. That week became 2. Then 3. Soon Rowan had become the person everyone trusted. Not because anyone hired him. Because he simply kept showing up. Then one Tuesday afternoon everything changed. Mrs. Holloway had mentioned her daughter was finally coming home after months away. Rowan picked up fresh groceries, added a bouquet of pink flowers he'd paid for himself because Mrs. Holloway loved spring blossoms even in winter, and drove to the familiar white house. He climbed the porch. Knocked twice. Footsteps approached. The door opened. Standing there, dressed in a tailored black suit and looking completely frozen, was Vanessa Ashcroft. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Recognition crossed her face almost immediately. "Rowan." He nodded once. "I was dropping these off." She looked from him to the grocery bags. Then back again. "I didn't know." Behind her, Mrs. Holloway called cheerfully from the living room. "Is Rowan here?" Vanessa stepped aside without saying another word. Mrs. Holloway smiled the moment she saw him. "There you are. I told my daughter about you every week." Rowan carefully placed the groceries on the kitchen counter, trying to ignore the uncomfortable silence filling the room. Vanessa watched him unpack milk exactly where Mrs. Holloway preferred it. Bread beside the fruit bowl. Soup in the pantry. Tea in the upper cabinet. It was obvious this wasn't his first visit. Not even close. Mrs. Holloway laughed. "You've spoiled me." Rowan shrugged. "You'd do the same for me." Vanessa quietly asked, "You've been helping my mother all this time." "She helped me too." "How?" "She reminded me not everyone measures a person's value by a job title." Silence settled over the kitchen again. For the first time since Rowan had known her, Vanessa looked uncertain rather than confident. She glanced around the house. The repaired lamp. The freshly shoveled walkway visible through the window. The fixed fence gate. Small things. Things she hadn't noticed because she hadn't been there often enough. She lowered her eyes. "I thought Mom hired someone." Mrs. Holloway answered before Rowan could. "I couldn't afford someone like him." She smiled gently. "Luckily, kindness doesn't send invoices." Vanessa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked toward the dining room window and stood there for a long moment, watching Owen outside filling the bird feeder they had repaired together weeks before. Vanessa remained by the window longer than anyone expected. She watched Owen sprinkle birdseed into the feeder while humming to himself. The little wooden feeder leaned slightly to one side because Rowan and Owen had repaired it instead of replacing it. Mrs. Holloway had insisted it looked more charming that way. Finally, Vanessa turned back toward Rowan. "I owe you an apology." He looked at her for a moment before answering. "You don't owe me anything today. Today is about your mom." Mrs. Holloway smiled faintly. She had lived long enough to recognize when two people were carrying conversations much heavier than the words they actually spoke. Vanessa nodded slowly. "I'd still like to apologize." Rowan didn't answer immediately. Months earlier he would have imagined this moment differently. Back then, he had pictured anger, sharp words, or the satisfaction of watching someone regret a bad decision. But standing inside Mrs. Holloway's warm kitchen, surrounded by grocery bags and the smell of fresh coffee, none of those feelings seemed worth holding on to. He simply said, "People make decisions. Sometimes they turn out to be the wrong ones." Mrs. Holloway excused herself to check the kettle, giving them a little privacy without making it obvious. Vanessa folded her hands together. "When I became CEO, I convinced myself every decision had to be about efficiency. I spent weeks looking at spreadsheets and reports. I knew everyone's employee number before I knew anyone's name." She gave a quiet, almost embarrassed laugh. "I thought I was making the company stronger." Rowan remembered that conference room. The polished table. The folder waiting in front of him before he even sat down. "You didn't just eliminate a position," he said calmly. "You eliminated 12 years of someone's life." She nodded. "I know." The admission surprised him. "There wasn't a single person willing to tell me I'd made a mistake," she continued. "Everyone was trying to impress the new CEO. My board praised the cost savings." She looked toward her mother. "But while I was chasing numbers, I barely noticed the person who mattered most was growing older without me." Mrs. Holloway returned carrying 3 mugs of tea. "Enough serious faces," she said gently. "Tea tastes better with lighter conversation." They all laughed quietly. For nearly an hour they talked about ordinary things. The unusually cold winter. Owen's school science project. Mrs. Holloway's attempts to grow tomatoes every spring despite years of disappointment. It was strangely comfortable. When Rowan finally stood to leave, Vanessa walked him outside. The afternoon sun had begun slipping behind tall maple trees, leaving long shadows across the quiet street. "I'd like to ask you something," she said. "If it's about coming back to Halcyon." "It is." Rowan smiled politely before she finished. "I'm not interested." She accepted the answer without arguing. "I understand." He adjusted the grocery bags that now held only the empty containers Mrs. Holloway wanted recycled. "I don't hate your company." "I know. I just don't think I belong there anymore." Vanessa nodded again. "I expected that." After a short pause she added, "Would you at least let me explain something?" Rowan waited. The board recently reviewed everything that happened during the restructuring. Employee turnover increased. Customer complaints doubled. Experienced supervisors left because they no longer felt respected. She sighed. "I spent months trying to fix problems I helped create." He appreciated her honesty, but it didn't erase the past. "I hope you do fix them," he said. "The people still working there deserve better." That was all. No dramatic confrontation. No triumphant speech. Just 2 adults standing beside an aging porch, talking honestly for the first time. Over the next several weeks, life continued much as before. Rowan delivered groceries. Owen finished another school project. Mrs. Holloway proudly announced she'd managed to keep one tomato plant alive indoors through the winter. But one noticeable change had taken place. Vanessa began visiting every weekend. At first the visits felt awkward. She wasn't sure where anything was in the kitchen anymore. She searched for mugs that had always been in the same cabinet. She overwatered her mother's plants. She forgot how her mother liked tea prepared. Mrs. Holloway teased her without mercy. "You've become very successful," she laughed one Saturday, "but apparently you've forgotten where I keep the sugar." Little by little, those visits became longer. Sometimes she stayed overnight. Sometimes she cooked dinner, although Mrs. Holloway politely suggested fewer experiments with expensive ingredients and more simple recipes. One afternoon Rowan arrived with groceries to find Vanessa repainting the old porch railing herself. There were streaks of white paint across one sleeve of her sweater. He couldn't help smiling. "I thought CEOs hired painters." She laughed. "My mother fired the last one." Mrs. Holloway called from inside. He charged too much and talked too little. The three of them shared an easy laugh that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Spring slowly replaced winter. The neighborhood trees filled with fresh green leaves. Birds returned to the feeder Owen faithfully filled every Saturday. One afternoon Rowan received a phone call from a regional food distribution company. Months earlier he had interviewed for an operations position and assumed they had chosen someone else. The hiring manager apologized. "We filled the role internally," she explained. "But another position just opened. Your references were exceptional." Rowan accepted the interview. A week later, he accepted the job. The salary wasn't extravagant. It didn't come with a corner office. But it offered stability, reasonable hours, and a workplace that valued experienced people instead of treating them like numbers. When he told Mrs. Holloway, she clapped her hands together. "I knew someone would eventually recognize what I've known all along." And what's that? Reliable people always find their way. On Rowan's first day at the new company, Owen insisted on ironing his father's shirt himself. The collar came out slightly crooked. Neither of them cared. As Rowan prepared to leave, Owen looked up at him. "You seem happier." "I think I am." "Because of the new job?" Rowan thought about it. "Partly." "What else?" He glanced toward the small white house across the neighborhood where Mrs. Holloway was probably watering flowers much earlier than necessary. "I remembered something important." "What's that?" "A person's worth isn't decided on the day they lose a job." Months later, Mrs. Holloway celebrated her 82nd birthday. The gathering was small. Neighbors brought homemade desserts. Children played in the yard. Someone strung simple lights across the fence even though the party ended before sunset. Vanessa arrived carrying a homemade apple pie. Mrs. Holloway examined it carefully. "You made this?" "I did." "We'll see." Everyone laughed. After dinner, Mrs. Holloway tapped her glass gently. "I've lived long enough to know people spend too much time chasing impressive moments." She looked around the backyard. "But life is mostly built from ordinary Tuesdays." Her eyes settled on Rowan. A bag of groceries. Then on Owen. A bird feeder. Then on Vanessa. A daughter deciding to come home. She smiled. Those things matter more than people realize. No one rushed to answer. The quiet itself felt meaningful. As the evening faded into soft golden light, Rowan realized something he hadn't understood during those difficult months after losing his job. Kindness hadn't solved every problem. It hadn't erased financial stress overnight. It hadn't rewritten the past. But it had quietly connected people who might otherwise have remained strangers carrying separate burdens. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was more than enough. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. Comment, kindness still exists, if you believe even one good act can change someone's life. The truth is, we rarely know where a simple act of kindness will lead. Holding a door, carrying a grocery bag, checking on a lonely neighbor, or simply showing up when someone needs help may never make headlines. But those ordinary choices often become the strongest bridges between people. In the end, Rowan didn't get his old job back, and he didn't need to. He built something far more valuable, a life defined not by what was taken from him, but by the kindness he chose to give away when he had every reason to stop.